A convicted killer is now charged with 2 more murders of a mother and a daughter in Stevens County. It's a case that languished for 27 years.
Colville, Washington wasn't the kind of place where sirens pierced the night. In 1997, this sleepy town of modest homes and familiar faces moved at an unhurried pace, its residents secure in their routines and trust in one another. The mobile home park on Orrin Rice Road was no different. A quiet community where neighbors knew each other's stories and doors stayed unlocked well after dark. But at 8:30 p.m. on June 27th, 2 explosions shattered that small town peace. As flames devoured a mobile home, reaching hungrily toward the darkening sky, residents rushed from their homes. What they found inside that inferno would be just the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt this community for nearly 3 decades. A mother's body bearing wounds that had nothing to do with the fire. A 12-year-old daughter who seemed to have vanished into thin air. And beneath the surface, a sinister web of connections to an outlaw motorcycle club that transformed this tragedy into something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. This is the story of Marlene and Cassandra Emerson, a mother and daughter whose brutal murders would perplex investigators for 27 years. It's a tale of betrayal, violence, and the relentless pursuit of justice. In a case that would prove that even in the quietest corners of America, darkness can find its way in. And sometimes the most chilling monsters aren't strangers. They're the people living right next door. But before we dive deeper into the mystery, I'd like to ask you a small favor. The statistics show that more than 70% of you watching aren't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into true crime and want to stay updated on future cases, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and ensure you don't miss out on any new videos.
Part of the delay in being able to charge this case comes from the fact that witnesses are extremely fearful.
Long before tragedy struck, Marlene Emerson was fighting her own battles. At 29, she was what locals called tough as nails, a single mother working multiple jobs to keep a roof over her daughter's head. Their home in the Orrin Rice Road Mobile Park wasn't much, but to Marlene and her 12-year-old daughter Cassandra, whom everyone knew as Cassie, it was everything they had. Marlene wasn't your typical small-town mother. Standing at the intersection of 2 worlds, she maintained connections with the Iron Horseman Motorcycle Club, an outlaw group whose reputation cast a long shadow over Colville. These weren't the kind of associations a mother would typically want. But in Marlene's world, survival sometimes meant dancing with devils. Despite the dangerous undercurrents in her life, Marlene was known for her fierce devotion to Cassie. Neighbors often saw them together, Marlene's protective instincts evident in every interaction. She'd move heaven and earth for that girl, one neighbor would later recall. Everything she did, every choice she made, was about giving Cassie a better life than she had. Cassie was a bright spot in the community, a 6th grader whose smile could light up a room. Teachers at her school described her as sweet and curious, always eager to learn. She had her mother's determination, but none of her hardness. A child who still believed in the good in people, even as her mother knew better. Her love for animals and natural ability to make friends marked her as someone special in the tight-knit community. But beneath their mother-daughter routines lay a complex web of relationships that would ultimately prove fatal. The Iron Horsemen weren't just a name whispered in fear around town. They were a very real presence in Marlene's life. Court documents would later reveal that her associations with the group went deeper than many realized, though the exact nature of these connections remained shrouded in mystery. The mobile home park itself seemed to exist in 2 realities. By day, it was a place where children played freely, and neighbors chatted over coffee. But as darkness fell, different figures emerged. Leather-clad bikers whose presence sent mothers hurrying their children inside. Marlene navigated both worlds with practiced ease. But those who knew her saw the toll it took. In the spring of 1997, tensions began to rise. Neighbors noticed more frequent visits from club members, and Marlene seemed increasingly on edge. She started keeping Cassie closer to home, their evening walks becoming less frequent. Something was changing. But in a community where asking too many questions could be dangerous, few dared to pry. One resident, who asked to remain anonymous, later told investigators she'd overheard heated arguments coming from Marlene's home in the weeks before the tragedy. There was fear in her voice, the witness recalled. Not the kind of fear you get from a normal dispute. This was different. This was the kind of fear that makes your blood run cold. What exactly Marlene knew, or what she might have done to cross the wrong people, would become central to the investigation. But in those final weeks of her life, she seemed to sense the noose tightening. She began making arrangements for Cassie's care, just in case, though she never specified what she feared might happen. The tragic irony was that in trying to protect her daughter, Marlene had unknowingly entangled them both in a web from which there would be no escape. The very connections she'd cultivated for survival would ultimately lead to their destruction. And on that warm June evening in 1997, all her fears would come terrifyingly true. June 27th, 1997 began like any other summer day in Colville. The mercury had climbed into the high 80s, and the evening brought little relief from the heat. At the mobile home park on Orrin Rice Road, residents were settling in for the night, their windows open to catch any hint of a breeze. 8:30 p.m., the explosion rocked the entire park. Then another. Before anyone could process what was happening, orange flames were already climbing the walls of Marlene's mobile home, the heat so intense it forced neighbors to retreat as they tried to approach. Frantic calls flooded the local 911 dispatch. "There's a fire. It's bad. I think someone's inside," one caller reported, the panic evident in their voice. By the time firefighters arrived the minutes later, the structure was fully engulfed. The intensity of the blaze and the speed with which it spread would later raise red flags for investigators. This was no accident. As firefighters finally brought the inferno under control and entered the smoldering remains, they made their first grim discovery. Marlene's body lay inside, but the fire wasn't what killed her. Deep knife wounds marked her neck, telling a story of violence that had nothing to do with the flames. The fire, investigators quickly realized, had been set to cover up something far more sinister. But where was Cassie? The question sent shockwaves through the community. Search parties formed immediately, combing the woods and abandoned buildings around Colville. Flyers with Cassie's photo appeared in every store window, on every telephone pole. The 12-year-old smile haunted the town, her absence a growing wound in the community's heart. Key witnesses soon came forward with disturbing details about that night. Multiple residents reported seeing a dark-colored Chevy Blazer speeding away from the scene shortly after the explosions. One neighbor described hearing a young girl's scream just before the first blast, though in the chaos that followed, no one could be certain. The investigation took an even darker turn when detectives discovered signs of a struggle inside what remained of the home. Blood spatter patterns suggested Marlene had fought for her life and likely witnessed something horrific before her death. The thought that she might have seen what was about to happen to her daughter would haunt investigators for years to come. For 4 weeks, hope dwindled with each passing day. Then, on July 27th, exactly 1 month after the fire, 2 hikers made a discovery that would confirm the community's worst fears. In a wooded area just miles from the mobile home park, they found Cassie's remains. The scene told its own horrific story. Like her mother, Cassie had died from knife wounds to her neck. The similarity in wounds suggested the same killer, a theory that would prove crucial years later. Her body had been left exposed to the elements. A final indignity that spoke to the killer's callousness. The medical examiner's report painted a timeline of terror. Cassie had likely been alive for hours after her mother's murder, a detail that would later keep investigators awake at night. What had she endured in those final hours? What had she seen? These questions would torment the community for decades to come. As detectives processed both scenes, a pattern emerged. The killer had been methodical, choosing to strike at night, using fire to destroy evidence, and disposing of Cassie's body far enough away to buy time. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. It was calculated, planned, and executed with chilling precision. The dual crime scenes, the burned-out mobile home and the remote woodland location, created a complex web of evidence for investigators to untangle. But one piece of evidence would prove particularly significant. Traces of gasoline found both at the fire scene and on Cassie's clothing, suggesting the same perpetrator had been present at both locations. The brutal nature of the crimes shocked even veteran investigators. This wasn't just murder, it was an execution, followed by a desperate attempt to erase all traces of the crime. But why? What could a mother and her young daughter have known or seen that would warrant such extreme measures? The answer, as investigators would learn, lay in the dangerous world Marlene had tried so hard to keep separate from her daughter's innocent one. A world that would eventually crash into their lives with devastating consequences. The Stevens County Sheriff's Office knew from the moment they arrived at the scene that this was no ordinary house fire. The intensity of the blaze, the strategic use of accelerants, and the brutal manner of Marlene's death all pointed to something far more sinister. But it was the disappearance of 12-year-old Cassie that turned this into a race against time. Detective Mark Thompson, the lead investigator, immediately noticed something odd about the fire pattern. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing, he would later testify. The accelerant wasn't just poured randomly, it was strategically placed to cause maximum damage and destroy specific areas of the home. This wasn't just about killing Marlene. Someone wanted to erase evidence. As forensics teams sifted through the charred remains of the mobile home, witness statements began painting a disturbing picture. Multiple residents described seeing a dark-colored Chevy Blazer near Marlene's home in the hours before the fire. One witness was particularly specific. It was Charles Tatum's vehicle. Everyone knew his Blazer. He'd had it for years. Charles Lloyd Tatum wasn't a stranger to law enforcement. In 1977, he'd been convicted of murder, serving time before returning to Colville. Now, in his mid-40s, he was a known associate of the Iron Horseman Motorcycle Club, living in the same mobile home park as Marlene. His name came up repeatedly in witness interviews, but people seemed hesitant to say too much. There was fear in their voices, one detective noted in his report. These weren't people afraid of the police. They were afraid of something else entirely. That something else, investigators suspected, wore leather vests and rode motorcycles. The breakthrough came when forensics teams processed Tatum's Blazer. Blood traces were found on the passenger side window, though, at the time, DNA technology wasn't advanced enough to make a definitive match. More telling was a cigarette butt in the ashtray. It would later prove crucial to cracking the case. But the most chilling evidence came from Cassie's recovery site. Tire tracks matching Tatum's Blazer were found nearby, and traces of gasoline on her clothing matched the accelerant used at the mobile home. The killer had transported her in that vehicle, likely while she was still alive. When questioned, Tatum remained eerily calm. He had an explanation for everything. He was home all night, the blood in his car came from a hunting trip, and he hadn't seen Marlene in weeks. His alibi seemed flimsy, But without concrete evidence linking him directly to the murders, investigators couldn't make an arrest. The investigation hit another wall when potential witnesses began changing their stories. People who had initially come forward suddenly claimed they couldn't remember what they'd seen that night. The influence of the Iron Horsemen was evident, their code of silence extending far beyond their membership. "We knew who did it," Detective Thompson would later recall. "We just couldn't prove it yet." The case had all the hallmarks of organized crime, a brutal execution, witnesses too terrified to talk, and a suspect with connections to a notorious motorcycle club. As weeks turned into months, the trail began to grow cold. Tatum remained free, continuing to live in the same community, a constant reminder of justice delayed. The Iron Horseman's presence in Colville seemed to grow stronger, as if emboldened by the inability of law enforcement to solve the case. For the investigators, the frustration was palpable. They had a suspect, a motive, and circumstantial evidence, but not enough to secure an indictment. The case would soon join the ranks of America's cold cases. But unlike many others, this one would never be forgotten. The image of Cassie's smile on those missing person posters would haunt the department for years to come. The initial investigation had revealed the outline of a horrific crime, but the full picture wouldn't emerge for nearly 3 decades. In the meantime, a killer walked free, protected by a web of silence and fear that would take years to unravel. Time has a way of burying secrets, but some wounds refuse to heal. For 27 years, the murders of Marlene and Cassie Emerson cast a long shadow over Colville. The mobile home park where they once lived gradually emptied, families moving away one by one, unable to shake the darkness that had settled over the community. Charles Tatum remained a constant presence in town, his Chevy Blazer, a grim reminder of that June night in 1997. Protected by his Iron Horseman connections and a wall of silence, he seemed untouchable. Some said he even bragged about it when drunk, certain no one could touch him. Detective Thompson refused to let the case go cold, regularly reviewing files and evidence logs. "Some cases just get under your skin," he would later say. This one wasn't just about murder. It was about a little girl who never got to grow up. The Stevens County Sheriff's Office kept Cassie's photo pinned to their bulletin board, a constant reminder of justice delayed. By 2017, 20 years after the murders, the case seemed destined to remain unsolved. Though the Iron Horsemen's influence had waned, their code of silence held firm. A newspaper anniversary story sparked fresh tips, but most led nowhere. The community had changed, but for those who remembered, the pain remained raw. The breakthrough came in 2020 with advances in DNA technology. Evidence carefully preserved for decades, including a cigarette butt from Tatum's Blazer and old blood samples, suddenly held new promise. As scientists worked, former Iron Horseman members began to talk. One revealed Marlene knew things she shouldn't have known. She was trying to protect her daughter, but nobody just walks away from that life. Tatum, now in his 70s, still lived freely in Colville. His eyes held the same cold intensity, and local children were still warned to stay away from his house. Meanwhile, Detective Thompson, though retired, never stopped thinking about the case. "Every time I drove past that mobile home park," he said, "I could still see the flames, still smell the smoke. Some cases never leave you."
It's not potential DNA. There is a DNA match. The only individual that was found to have DNA mixed with Cassandra Emerson.
By 2024, forensic scientists made the breakthrough that would shatter 27 years of silence. Using advanced techniques, they found something chilling on the cigarette butt from Tatum's Blazer, DNA from both him and Cassie Emerson. But it wasn't just the presence of DNA that spoke volumes. It was the location. The DNA was concentrated around the filter, the lab report noted. This suggested direct oral contact. The implications were horrifying. Cassie had been forced to smoke during her final hours. Blood evidence from the passenger window told an equally damning story, confirming she had fought for her life. As the evidence mounted, the Iron Horseman's wall of silence crumbled. Former members came forward, including one who recalled Tatum bragging about the murders. He said the fire was beautiful, the witness revealed. He talked about it like he was describing a sunset, not a murder. Most damning was testimony from a former club member who had been with Tatum that night. He described how Marlene had threatened to expose the club's activities. She thought if she threatened them, they'd leave her alone. Instead, they sent Tatum to silence her. The case was now airtight. DNA evidence matching wound patterns and witnesses ready to testify. In December 2024, District Attorney Erica George made the decision it was time to move on Tatum. Sometimes justice moves slowly, she would later say, but it never stops moving forward. In the early morning hours of December 14th, 2024, a convoy of unmarked police vehicles quietly surrounded Charles Tatum's home in Colville. The 77-year-old former Iron Horseman associate had lived there for decades, seemingly untouchable, just miles from where he had murdered Marlene and Cassie Emerson. The arrest itself was anticlimactic. Tatum, now an old man but still carrying himself with the same cold demeanor, offered no resistance. As officers led him out in handcuffs, neighbors watched from behind curtained windows. Some had waited 27 years to see this moment. He just looked, empty, one detective noted. Like someone who had been waiting for this day, knowing it would eventually come. The man who had terrorized a community for nearly 3 decades went quietly into custody, his only words being a quiet request for his medication. At the Stevens County Courthouse, District Attorney Erica George laid out the charges. 2 counts of first-degree aggravated murder. The evidence she presented painted a chilling picture of premeditated violence. Tatum had not only killed Marlene and Cassie, he had made them suffer, leaving a traumatic legacy that would haunt their community for generations. The courtroom fell silent as George revealed the forensic findings. The DNA evidence wasn't just damning, it was devastating. Blood from the passenger window of Tatum's Blazer, the cigarette butt with both his and Cassie's DNA. 27 years of scientific advancement had finally caught up with him. But perhaps most powerful was the testimony of former Iron Horseman members. No longer bound by their code of silence, they described how Tatum had boasted about the murders, even keeping mementos from that night. One former member recalled him saying, "Fire cleanses all sins," a reference to his attempt to destroy evidence in the blaze. During his arraignment, Tatum maintained the same emotionless expression he'd worn since his arrest. When the judge denied bail, citing his violent history and the risk of flight, he showed no reaction. It was as if the decades of carrying his dark secret had hollowed him out completely. The impact of his arrest rippled through Colville. For many, it was the closing of a chapter that had been left painfully open since 1997. "It's like we can finally breathe again," one longtime resident said. "We always knew he did it. Now everyone else knows too." Detective Thompson, long retired but present for the arrest, summed it up best. "Sometimes evil hides in plain sight, thinking time will protect it, but time can also be its undoing. Today, time finally caught up with Charles Tatum." What happened to Marlene and Cassie Emerson in 1997 changed Colville forever. But their story isn't just about tragedy. It's about justice that refused to be denied, about investigators who never gave up, and about a community that never forgot. As Tatum awaits trial in the Stevens County Jail, one question remains: how many other secrets does he carry? How many other families are still waiting for answers? If you've been following cold cases like this one, make sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this case, and don't forget to hit that notification bell to stay updated on similar content.